Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Periodic Tuesday Race Talks. This is a time when we've all been focused on race and thinking about race. People throughout the nation are awaiting the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial, where he's been charged with the killing of George Floyd. We've been told that the verdict will be released today, which may result in us ending a few minutes before we typically would. We are delighted to have with us today Jim Freeman, who is the author of a recently released book, which really captured my attention. This book is Rich from Racism. And those words put together really drew me to this story because it promised to be a different account of the nature of racism and how racism operates. So Jim Freeman is a longtime civil rights attorney, a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Notre Dame. He's also a former Skadden Fellow, and he worked for many years as a senior attorney at the Advancement Project, which is a nationally known civil rights organization, which itself is really pioneering and innovative. We've had many great lawyers from Stanford and associated with Stanford be a part of the Advancement Project. He served under President Obama as a commissioner in the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans as well. And of particular relevance for all the students here, after law school, he completed a clerkship. He is yet more evidence of the virtues of doing a clerkship. He clerked for Judge James Browning on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In addition, he's been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and the University of Denver, where he now leads the Social Movement Support Lab. And we'll talk more about that later. The Social Movement Support Lab is a recently founded initiative. They were bold enough to actually stand it up and get it running during COVID. It started just last fall. And the goal of that project is to undermine systemic racism and create social change in American society. So Jim Freeman, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Rick. It's great to be here with you.
So let's start with we're going to talk about the book, but let's start with just a controversy that's riveted the nation. People all over the country, not only in Minnesota, are focused right now and have been focused on the Derek Chauvin trial in the killing of George Floyd. That's attracted extraordinary attention. It feels some way that it's, if not a referendum, then something close to that with respect to American justice. What are your thoughts about the trial? What should we take from it? What do we learn from this experience?
Yeah, I think the referendum for me is everything that happened between George Floyd being killed and then Daunte Wright being killed last week. Like not even 10 miles away, because for me it's been almost a year since George Floyd was killed. It'll be a year in May 25th, and we were told over and over at the time that this was a wake-up call for our nation. We heard that so many times. But, the thing is that, like so many times before, we didn't actually wake up, And if we had, we would have, over the last 11 months, we would have come together as a country around real solutions to these issues, to systemic racism. We would have addressed our really perverse public investment strategy, where we severely overinvest in the criminalization of people of color and dramatically underinvest in the systems and strategies that would create healthier, safer, and more equitable communities. We would have dismantled, or at least started to dismantle, the vastly oversized, suppressive, and violent criminal justice system that's being used within Black and Brown communities as a sort of catch-all solution for a huge variety of public health and safety issues. These are the things that are at the very root of what killed George Floyd. They're the dynamics that make Black and Brown people dying at the hands of the police a 100% completely predictable result. But because we couldn't summon the collective urgency to address them, now Dante Wright is dead. And so really what the book was about is why we haven't addressed them, why we didn't address them, for the last 40 years, and why we haven't addressed it for the last 11 months. Because it's not because we don't know how. It's because there's a very well-funded opposition that stands in the way.
So let me ask you this. So we're going to talk a lot about that well-funded opposition and the nature of that opposition. But let's just pause on the how. So in the criminal justice system, we've had lots of debates about lots of reforms. One of the pivotal divides there is that between people who are abolitionists versus people who are reformers. What are your thoughts on that, on that choice, that dichotomy, and even on the framing of that as the dichotomy? Are you an abolitionist? Are you a reformer? Or like any good law student, you can reject the characterization and think about it differently. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, of course I reject the premise. I went to law school too. No, I mean, I am evolving. I'm learning constantly. I think it's fair to say that, when I came out of law school, before I graduated law school, for a long time, even during the time when I was practicing, when my work early on in my career was more focused on education than criminal justice, you probably would have described me as, a reformer, a reformist. And, I would say now my approach is this, is my approach is to ask, what are the best strategies available to us for both preventing and responding to crime and violence in a way that promotes safer, healthier, and more equitable communities? And when I answer that question based on everything that I've seen, I see no evidence at all that would suggest that our criminal justice system is the answer to that question, and mountains of evidence that it isn't. And I think regardless of whether someone defines themselves as an abolitionist or not, I think everyone should be able to agree that over time, we should be working toward building a world in which we don't need people with guns to intervene, where we don't need to keep each other in cages. That should be something we can all agree on. People might have different views about how long that's going to take and what the methods are and so on. But I would like to think that we could all at least come together on setting that as our North Star and working backwards from there.
So abolitionism is the long-term North Star, but in the short term, we need to have concrete reforms that move us toward that. And then in the book, you argue, or you say that there are desirable reforms that have not been undertaken due to political/economic resistance on the other side. That there are forces that are actively working against reforms that you think would be desirable. So in the criminal justice system, just give us one or two reforms that you think would be clearly desirable, but haven't been implemented because of economic/political resistance on the other side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think of it in terms of, if I do a scan of basically every state in the country, and I look at their criminal justice policies and laws, I want to know why they got there, why they stay there, why they're so hard to undo all what I call the mass criminalization and incarceration system. And so when I say the well-funded opposition, what I mean is that you have organizations like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, representing hundreds of the largest corporations in the US, who for decades have been working to implement these various tough on crime policies, mandatory minimum policies, truth in sentencing laws, 3 strikes laws, and so on. You have super wealthy individuals like the Koch brothers and the billionaires that they've organized over the years, pouring tens of millions of dollars into various right-wing think tanks and advocacy organizations that have been pushing this agenda and continue to do so today. You have one of those think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, just as an example, that after the uprising last summer, against systemic racism. What they did was they launched a Back the Blue police pledge that has been signed by 200 members of Congress. So 200 members of Congress who have vowed to continue supporting the status quo in law enforcement in this country, and also helping to make police the enormously powerful political force that they are. And so in other words, like, these folks are organizing not to stop people from being killed, but in support of the people responsible for killing them. And so one of those 200 members of Congress, as an example, Tom Cotton, very powerful senator from Arkansas, tweets out just like a week ago that he says that in the US, we have a major under-incarceration problem. Now, bear in mind that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Yeah, I did not hear that tweet. Okay.
Yeah, well, he said that repeatedly over the years.
Okay.
And by the way, our former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, said the same thing. So it takes some seriously twisted logic to be able to get yourself to that point. And that, for me, is, a perfect example of what modern day systemic racism looks like. Is we implement these public policies that we know will inflict needless harm on large groups of people, that we know will perpetuate racial inequities, that we know without a doubt will lead to people being killed. And then when that harm becomes apparent, we fail to address it appropriately, in significant part because it is economically beneficial for the ultra wealthy to not do so.
Right. So, I mean, you raise a lot of issues there. So, but in one question that arises is, what would presumably, some people who are more conservative and who are promoting what might be called, quote, conservative responses to criminal justice, they would not say that they are out to do ill. They would say that they have different ideas about how to move forward, how to make American society better, even how to promote racial equity. And that people just have different theories about what's the best way forward. They would look, for example, at policing and say policing is such a tough job that we need good people in policing. And if we don't support police officers and good people won't come to policing, other people will leave policing, police forces will be decimated. That's not the sort of situation that's going to serve society. What do you say to that explanation for why people support the policies that they do?
Yeah, I know there are certainly a lot of people who support those types of policies for a variety of reasons. And I know there are a lot of people who advance those policies for a lot of reasons. But regardless of people's stated intent, I believe folks have to be held accountable for the harm that they've caused, whether it was well-intentioned or not. Right? Because, the way I think about it is, if I burn down my neighbor's house, yes, it matters whether it was done out of malice or done out of negligence. But either way, they don't have a house because of me. And so it's my responsibility to repair the harm that I've caused and make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I think the same is true for racial justice. Like, we all have racial blind spots. We've all, well, at least all of us who are a certain adult age, probably have contributed in some way to these dynamics, in some way to this harm. We've all supported politicians who've probably taken these positions, or, lots of different ways that we do this. But when it comes to racial justice, the only hope we have is that if we have sort of a reckoning, both individually and collectively, about what we've done and how we can fix it and prevent it from happening again. And so when it comes to folks who have invested millions, in some cases billions of dollars, into advancing policies that have caused real devastation in communities across the country, they need to be held accountable for that. But what happens is, one, they often do it in secret. So that leads me to question the motivation. But two, even if they don't, then they also become very good at deflecting blame and avoiding responsibility. And the rest of us have a responsibility to do something we don't often do, which is keep the focus on the two most important questions for any public policy.
Mhm.
who benefits and who is harmed.
Mhm.
And it's undoubtedly true that, whether they care to admit it or not, the ultra wealthy in this country have benefited greatly from these systems that have been enormously destructive to Black and brown communities. And again, regardless of what their intentions are, they need to be held accountable for that.
Okay, so let's go with that. I want to come back to some concrete policies later, but let's go with that question. So you highlight, I mean, wonderfully, the extent to which there's a lot of money flowing into policies that are injurious and that compound inequality, right? You talk about private prisons, for example, and all the companies that make money off of the prison system and how they do so. So you talk about all of that, and those are rich people who own those companies and the shareholders of those companies who profit. But I take it that you're also making or maybe you're not, making a broader point that the ultra wealthy as a category of people, they target from racism and racial injustice as well, right? So what comes to mind is, well, how, and I want to try to figure out, how is that so? So does Jeff Bezos, or let's even say George Soros, right, who's very liberal, do they benefit from racism, or are the beneficiaries of racism the people who are just directly putting the money into the racist institutions and racist policies?
No, I think, one thing I do spend some time talking about in the book is how, um, there's a certain group of super wealthy billionaires and multimillionaires who have who are advancing a political agenda.
Yep.
And a big chunk of that goes to uphold systemic racism.
Mhm.
That's not to say every billionaire does it
Mhm.
or every multimillionaire does it. They don't in that very active way, but a lot more do than I think many of us think would
Mhm.
do that,
Mhm.
which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. So there's that causal element there.
Mhm.
Um, but then one thing I talk about in the book, though, is the lots of other people benefit in a variety of ways. Lots of people support that in a variety of ways. What I also say is that many of us, particularly white people, have been essentially deputized
Mhm.
by the ultra wealthy to advance their agenda, because they couldn't do it without us.
Mhm.
They couldn't do it if all their investments in think tanks and advocacy organizations and media outlets and so on, if we didn't take all of those messages that we ingest on a daily basis, if we didn't take those policy proposals that they advance and run with them and advance them and push them out into the world. Like, they need us to do that. And so that also makes us complicit.
Mhm.
And it also makes, the gold, the warm-hearted billionaire,
Mhm.
maybe more progressive, politically progressive individual like George Soros, he's also benefiting in some ways.
And how is that? How does a George Soros or Jeff Bezos, how do they benefit from racial inequity? And you would think that, so someone like Jeff Bezos, you would think that Amazon benefits from having more people who are earning money, who are working, who are thriving, who can use Amazon. But you're suggesting that they actually benefit from inequality.
Sure. So take our education system,
Mhm.
right? At no time in US history have we had a racially equitable education
Mhm.
system. Like, that is pretty much the defining feature of our education system. And there's been no point where you could ever, in history, where you could ever go into a school within, go into schools within communities of color and expect to find the same level of educational opportunities
Mhm.
as white youth. And our schools have never been designed, like, we think of them as youth development institutions, organizations, but they've never actually been that. They've never been funded that way. They've never been structured that way. They've never been operated that way. And a big part of that is because of how we fund our schools, and to put a finer point on it, how we underfund schools within communities of color. So when it comes to education, like, we haven't put enough money in, like, collectively, and the people who benefit the most are the people who have the most money, because
Mhm.
they have not paid their fair share in taxes. They
Mhm.
are typically the ones leading the charge to avoid paying their fair share in taxes when these kind of things
Mhm.
come up for legislative proposals. And not to say George Soros or anyone else in particular has done that,
Right.
but so, part of their wealth has been accrued from the fact that, they haven't invested in communities of color the way that they should have been.
Right. Okay. So we need more investment from those who are able to pay, which is fluent people in society, which is a group that's going to be disproportionately white.
Sure.
Okay. So and sometimes though, and these are kind of high level issues. Sometimes in the book you talk of whites as benefiting from racism, but other times you refer to whites as being burdened by racism in a way. So could you talk about those two ideas? Whites as benefiting from racism, but then whites is also just regular white people, frankly, not the George Soros or Jeff Bezos,
Right.
but just kind of regular white people as being burdened by racism.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily so much like burdened by racism, but burdened by the same political agenda that is perpetuating systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think one thing that was really important for me to recognize, and I think it's important for all of us to recognize, is that the injustice that's being engineered by this group of billionaires and multimillionaires hasn't been limited to people of color, and their portfolio is far more diversified than that.
Yep.
And that was really apparent to me when I was doing the research for the book, and I'm spending months looking at the tax returns for these
Mm-hmm.
super wealthy people, and I was trying to investigate what they were investing in this preservation of systemic racism and the ideology that guided those. And as I was doing that, I realized how heavily invested they are in pushing a political agenda that has been deeply harmful to most white folks as well. So, in other words, if white people examine the reasons their lives are far more difficult than they need to be, it will eventually run into the same set of organizations and individuals who are leading the opposition against racial equality.
Right.
So, I, for one, was sort of astonished to discover just how enormous an influence this very small group of people has on my life and that of every other white person I know, and not in positive ways.
Yep.
And that only became clear to me once I just looked through these pages and pages and pages and pages of donations that these folks were making, huge donations into organizations that were actively lifting up an agenda that was, I think, deeply harmful to low-income, working class, and middle-class people of all races.
Okay. Can you give us an example or two of a way in which people are supporting initiatives that both exacerbate racism, but then also harm regular white people at the same time?
Sure. I mean, a key part of this agenda is fighting increases to the minimum wage. That obviously affects people of all races. It depresses wage levels all across the board. This key part of this agenda is cutting services, cutting public investment in services for, particularly for low-income, working class, and middle-class people. So that's in education, that's in healthcare, that's in all sorts of things. How we treat healthcare as a privilege and not a right. That is something that has been fought for by these predominantly corporate and Wall Street forces. So when somebody has to start a GoFundMe page to pay for an operation, it's in large part because of that. And sad part is that there are thousands and thousands of people who have to do that.
Yep.
So we could go on, but what I write in the book, and this is not something I had put in these terms before I started researching and writing it, was that this very small group of people has way more influence over the public policy decisions that affect our lives than the rest of us combined. And that is, that disproportionately affects people of color, but it doesn't only affect people of color.
Right.
So one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was point out, this convergence of interests and the need for multiracial movement building to address that.
Right. So it sounds like the ultra wealthy, they have more influence, not because that's inevitable, but because other people haven't recognized the dynamic that's at work and haven't mobilized to counter that. And what you're proposing is that people of all races come together to counter these political agendas that actually work to the detriment of most people and benefit a small group of people.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's totally fair. I don't think there's anything inevitable about it.
Yep.
And I do say in the book, like there is really only one effective counterweight
Yep.
to the power of organized wealth, and that's the power of organized people.
Yep. 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 So let me ask you, so how have, we started off talking about racial inequity and, the practices that sort of reinforce racism in society. And then we have shifted now to looking at how white people, you said, have become deputized in these efforts to promote injustice. So how is it that white people have become deputized or sort of complicit in supporting policies that, in your view, are actually detrimental to them as well?
Yeah. So, criminal justice is a good example as any. But it's true. So in the book, I focus on 3 issues in particular: criminal justice, education, and immigration. And it's true for all of them, but we can use criminal justice as the example. So we have created, particularly over the last 40 years, an exponentially larger criminal justice system. That's police, that's prosecutors, that's courts. And it's grown, it's more than tripled in size, even if you adjust for inflation over that time. And so a large part of that is directed at Black and brown communities, right? The dynamics that I was talking about earlier, about how we have really dramatically expanded police forces, given them far more license to use extremely violent and aggressive tactics and so on. And obviously that has been most harmful within those communities of color. However, it's not, those aren't the only places where those things are having an effect. Now, you don't see the type of stop and frisk practices and the type of brutality in predominantly white communities that you see in communities of color, but you do see an increasing tendency to give the police more jobs to do in ways that we didn't before. And the other thing is, we just released this new set of dashboards, defunddata.org, where we sort of show the increase in spending over time, but then we also examine the city budgets for the 25 largest cities in the country and how they're investing in the criminal justice system on one side and on other things that we call healthy community essentials like mental and behavioral health and affordable housing and arts and culture and parks and recreation and so on. And what you see, I think, very clearly is that the criminal justice system has soaked up so many of these resources that that they receive an overwhelming amount of the public investment. Meanwhile, all these other things that I think everyone agrees are important to creating a healthy society, a healthy environment in which to live and raise family and whatever, they're dramatically underfunded, right? And so, again, that mostly affects people of color.
Right.
But it doesn't only affect people of color.
Right. Right. But how is it, I'm still wondering, maybe I didn't quite catch it, but how is it that so many people and I'm always struck by this, that so many people go along with policies that turn out to be so ruinous, right? Because we are perhaps the richest nation in the world, yet on one indicator after another, our people are not faring better than people elsewhere. We're actually faring worse in a lot of regards, and incarceration is one very salient one, where we're at the bottom of the heap when we should be at the top of the heap. So how is it that we've gone along for so long with these policies and all of the financial commitments and the draining of resources and so forth? I mean, what's went wrong so that we've gone along with that? And we've talked about the rich people promoting them, but there's a mass of people who've allowed that to happen as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd say two things. I mean, one is in part because of the massive racial inequities we have in this country, our experiences with these issues are very different. And two, because of, and I spent a lot of time in the book talking about this, because of the public relations campaign that has gone into selling these ideas. So on the first one, in my day-to-day job, I encounter police a lot. But if I subtract that from my experience, and I subtract, let's say, getting pulled over for a ticket or something, if I subtract that, I don't think I've had a conversation with a police officer in 25 years.
Right.
Like they don't talk to me.
Yep.
I don't exist for them. And so my experience, my personal experience, taking aside the professional, my personal experience, there is nothing in common with what the communities that I work with, what they experience on a day-to-day, with police. I have a friend who lives in a neighborhood on the North Shore of Chicago. When you move into that neighborhood, it's a very, very wealthy neighborhood. You give a copy of your keys to the police department so that when you're out of town,
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're out of town,
this is that area. This is Winnetka and New Trier High School.
Yeah,
and all those areas,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah. They come check on your house for you 3 times a day.
Wow.
So when I share that with, young Black and brown youth who live in, South side of Chicago or, South LA or, whatever, North Philadelphia, like they literally can't fathom that.
Yep. I'm having a hard time fathoming that. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
And so for most people, for most white people, I should say, like policing and police have become sort of synonymous with safety, right? We've been, as some very good abolitionists say, like the police aren't only in our, in the neighborhoods, they're in our heads too. And so that's a big part of it, is that when I have these conversations, my day-to-day work, I'm working, like I said, with Black and brown communities across the country. When I talk to like white folks, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So that's part of it. But the other part is, and by the way, that's true for the other issues too,
right.
For immigration and education.
Right. But people are just so one part of the problem, just to be clear, is that we have allowed as a society bad stuff to happen because we're unaware of how much bad stuff is happening because it's happening to people other than us. And the impacts on us in terms of tax money that's misspent and misused, those impacts are so diffuse that we just don't focus on that.
Right. And the residents of the people who are, or the residents of the communities that are most directly impacted by these dynamics are given virtually no platform to share their experiences. Like you just don't see those folks, on the news or at conferences or wherever else we get our information. That just doesn't happen. So that's one part. And the other part is, though, like I said, there's been a very, very, very well-funded public relations campaign to advance these ideas. So again, they weren't just, they weren't just investing in ALEC and trying to get their policies passed. They were investing in think tanks to develop a whole ideology around this stuff. They were investing in media outlets to advance these ideas. And that's true in criminal justice, it's true in education, it's true in immigration. So, one thing to think about now is after last summer, I don't know how things are in your area, in the Bay Area, with the media there. But if I look at my local newspaper, or I look at other newspapers in cities where I work, there's been a very dramatic uptick in the number of articles about how the crime rate's going up, or in the lifestyle section, you might see a profile of the newest canine, the canine unit, the dog, or you might see, what you often see here is on the front page is attacks on Black Lives Matter leaders and activists. So, so it's not accidental, like nobody's born thinking that tough on crime is a good idea. We're taught that. And, there are values in there. They're expert messengers.
Right.
And so there's values in there that resonate with some part of us.
Well, yeah. Let me ask you though, because and I maybe I'm channeling the spirit of so many of my rich white friends in the Bay Area, who are typically very liberal, right? And they might say, well, sure, there are very well-moneyed conservative groups out there that are pushing certain solutions, and there are moneyed liberal groups as well who are pushing other solutions. In California, for example, we have philanthropists here who have given tens of millions of dollars already in an effort to raise $100 million war chest for what they call the Black Freedom Fund, which is going to fund African-American led nonprofits and empower them in policymaking, right? And that's a lot of money, $100 million. And that's mostly coming presumably from fairly liberal people of means. So why, call out, conservative funders in particular, when you have, liberal funders as well who are on the other side? Is the problem, to what extent is the problem just that there's so much money generally, irrespective of which side it's on? And let me frame the question more abstractly. We could say, is racial justice compatible with the sort of economic inequality that we have now? Or do we need to first address can we hope to address racism without addressing economic inequality?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that the one reason why I called it out in the book is because I think if we have to have any chance of actually dismantling systemic racism, we have to call it out. We have to be very clear about what the causes are and how to address them. And that if you stand in the way of that, then you're standing in the way of racial justice, right? If you cast a vote for policies that uphold these structures, then you're casting a vote for systemic racism. If you're donating to these causes, then you're donating to the perpetuation of systemic racism. We haven't been clear enough about that. And so that's one of the reasons I did it. But the other thing is, we should talk about scale, because $100 million is great. But in the book, for the Black Freedom Fund, I take your word for it that they're funding the right things that we want to fund.
Or let me give you another example. So, in the time since George Floyd was killed, many corporations, as you know, and this is not within the scope of the book, but many corporations have made pledges. And McKinsey has estimated that the amount of corporate dollars that have been pledged toward, racial justice, whatever that means, racial justice, is somewhere north of 60 some billion dollars. 60 some billion dollars in pledges, to be paid out over years, all manner of corporations. What do you think of that? Is that going to be a sufficient counterweight to the interest on the conservative side, or no?
So here's what I'd say. So one is 66 billion seems like a lot of money.
It is a lot of money.
For me it is, but bear in mind that one guy, Jeff Bezos, he increased his net worth by 75 billion last year.
Yes. Yes.
So
most of which he did not donate. Yes.
Yeah, most of which he did not donate. So maybe we shouldn't be too impressed. But the other thing, I think it is important to interrogate like what it is that they're spending on.
Yep.
Because much of the time they're on things like charter schools and school voucher programs, which I dedicated a very long chapter to in the book because of all the problems there. Or they spend on things like diversity initiatives, oftentimes pretty superficial diversity initiatives, or dedicating some tiny percentage of their profits to Black-owned businesses, or charities that are focused on providing some sort of service within communities of color. And those aren't bad things per se, but it's important to point out what they're not spending on, which maybe unlike the Black Freedom Fund that you mentioned, they're typically not spending on strategies and organizations that seek to truly dismantle systemic racism, not, put a Band-Aid on it. And the other thing I would love to say is, those are the types of initiatives that Americans, and particularly white Americans, we love to congratulate ourselves for. Like, we've been patting ourselves on the back for, making progress on racial equity for a very long time. Like, well over 100 years we've been doing this. And about how much progress we're making towards racial equity. But, like, I guess to paraphrase James Baldwin, like, how much more time do we need for this progress of ours? How many more lives are we going to allow to be harmed or taken while we're content not to actually solve the problem, but just to make progress? And, the third thing I would say about that 66 million from McKinsey is the biggest reason why that they've done that those corporations have done that is because the racial justice movement put so much pressure on them that it became politically untenable to simply do nothing, as they have for most of history. So I think a critically important takeaway from this effort is that the movement is having success, that organizing within these companies and outside these companies is working, and that we need to continue to do so to really move the needle. The last thing I'll say is, I do have a hard time when I see these companies taking victory laps about all the things that they've done to promote racial justice in the last 9 months or 11 months, whatever. Because, my day to day, when I'm out with the folks who are doing the real work on the ground to dismantle these systems, and they're getting hit hard right now by those who are resistant to change. I mean, it's really rough out there right now. And I don't see any of those corporations who are so proud of their efforts doing anything to help out. So all that is to say, when it comes to these corporations supposedly turning over a new leaf, I, for one, am not too impressed.
So, the way I think about it is it's a lot easier to appear to be anti-racist than it is to actually undermine racism. And those are different things, right?
That is very well put.
Yes, those are different things. So let me bring it down, because we don't have that much more time to bring it down to earth to the law school, this law school and others. You and I are both, lawyers by training. You graduated from Harvard Law School about a decade after I did. Harvard Law School, like Stanford Law School and many other institutions, are very wealthy, very prominent, very elite. The majority of the graduates of places like Stanford or Harvard, they go on to work for large corporations or work for large law firms who work for large corporations and some of the wealthiest people in the nation. They are, in fact, likely to be working for some of the very corporations that you or I might criticize, or for some of the very people that we might criticize, because those are the people and entities that have the money to hire their employers. Right. So what does that mean for an institution like Stanford or for the students here? Is Stanford Law School, or Stanford graduates, and Stanford Law School complicit in racism? Are Stanford graduates who go to work for large law firms which serve the clients that you've been implicitly talking about, are they acting in a way that's complicit with racism? How do we think about those intersections?
Yeah. So, I mean, these are These are good questions and hard questions. I mean, one thing I'll say, first of all, is,
And I should, well, let me flag that. Well, I'll give you a moment to think about that. This
no, I want to talk.
no, but this is a question from the chat. So I'll say this is
Okay.
this is actually a student's question, right? Because it is a wonderful question, because it poses, in a sense, the conflict that I highlighted a few minutes ago. Is there a tension between the eliteness that we are all wedded to and a part of, and that we perpetuate? Is there a tension between that and our racial justice aspirations?
Yes.
That's kind of an abstract.
Yes, there is. Let me elaborate. So first, a little bit of context. Before I ever went to law school, I worked at a company called Arthur Andersen. That probably doesn't mean anything to students now, but at the time I worked there, was the largest professional services firm in the world.
Yep.
And I was doing economic and financial consulting, and many of my clients were big corporate law firms, and we were serving as sort of their damages experts on mostly like intellectual property litigation, but also some insurance cost recovery work. So I was working on behalf of large corporate polluters, and I was working in some big corporate litigation. And so I'm, I don't judge people who take those jobs. I would encourage folks to, to really take a critical eye to the work that they do. Because one thing I say oftentimes at law schools is, and when I teach, is that we talk in law school a lot about justice, and how we are, bringing more justice into the world and so on. In my experience, far more often than that, the graduates of the law school that I went to, and law schools like it, serve as the guardians of oppressive systems.
Ooh, we need to pause on that. Ooh, guardians of oppressive systems. Okay. I mean, no one should feel good about that, right? So now we need to say, like, what do we do with that? Once you recognize that, or let's just say, as an institution, Stanford Law School does not want to be, or the law school that we both graduated from does not want to be the guardian of an oppressive system, presumably. So what should a place like Stanford do to not be the guardian of an oppressive system? What's our proper stance in response to the killing of George Floyd?
Well, one thing that a number of us over the last 5 or 10 years have been spending a lot of time doing is developing out this idea of movement lawyering, right? So what does it mean to be a lawyer whose work is centered around supporting racial justice efforts of the most directly impacted people, right? And that's something that you can support from any type of practice setting. Like, you can support racial justice movements from any type of practice setting, and that includes private practice. Like, we don't spend much time thinking about this or talking about this, but like during the 1960s era civil rights movement, the lawyers who were providing most of the support to Dr. King and SNCC and those folks were mostly like New York private firm lawyers. Now it's harder to do that now because of Bill Bauer requirements and all that stuff, but we've kind of lost that history a little bit. And personally, I think that, for the legal profession to do what it needs to do in support of racial justice, like organizing the private bar is a necessary component of that. So I very much encourage and support all efforts to do so.
And how about a law school? So this is a private, so basically firms should encourage pro bono on behalf of their lawyers. Lawyers should pursue pro bono, and that's a way to reconcile your being in a place that is the guardian of injustice with your desire to promote justice. Okay, but what about the institution itself, like a university or a law school, or the University of Denver? Are there?
Well, see, I have to be careful here because among other reasons, my wife is the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at University of Denver Law School. So what I'll say,
Well, you can tell us what you would tell her to do.
well, I wouldn't tell her to do anything, but I very much support her efforts, and she is leading a very exciting and very successful effort to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a far more holistic and comprehensive way.
Yep.
Where yes, they want to bring more students from the communities most directly impacted by systemic racism into the law school.
Mm-hmm.
But they also want to transform the environment within the law school so that so that the culture becomes more supportive of students of color and of racial justice, generally speaking. And she's really leading an effort to direct more resources to supporting students who want to go out and support racial justice movements. And so University of Denver Law School over the last several years, since she's been there, has targeted way more resources into those types of endeavors than it was previously. So, I think it's actually a great example of how an institution in a very short amount of time can begin to transform itself in a way that, not only benefits individual students who are coming into the building, but it benefits the community around it and the global community writ large.
Yeah. Okay. You said the right thing. That's good. So that's good. Let's talk about the University of Denver a bit, because you're directing a program there that is aiming to further movements for racial justice. Could you tell us about the program? What are you doing? How did it start? What's your vision?
Yeah. So, I've been practicing what we might call movement lawyering, racial justice movement lawyering in particular, for a long time. And, that for those who don't know, like, that's a form of lawyering where, or at least the way I've practiced it, I've always led with, asking what the communities, what they need from me. Because when I came out of law school, I was like, oh, I got all these new tools at my disposal. I'm going to go into the community and I'm going to say, like, who needs this kind of help? Because I'm trained now and I can help. And what I quickly learned is that, all the things that I've been trained to do, it's not that they weren't needed. It's just that there were a bunch of other things that were needed more. So I go in and so I started asking, like, okay, what do you need? What kind of help do you need to create the change that you want to create? And so what folks would say is, we need data. We need other kinds of research. We need help, writing this policy. We need help with communications. We need help writing a report or an issue brief or a fact sheet or a one page or whatever it is. We need help organizing our folks so that we can create this change. And I didn't know how to do any of those things. So over the last, 18 years or so, I've had to teach myself how to do a lot of those things so I could be more useful to movements. So what we're doing, and then over the years, I've taught movement lawyering at a couple of different institutions. But what we're doing now is, you have a rich private university like University of Denver that has, all these amazing students and faculty members, these really incredible skill sets, and they're not at all connected to these movements. So what we're trying to do at the Social Movement Support Lab is basically be a conduit for students, faculty, staff, and alums from the University of Denver to be able to connect to these racial justice movements. And the movements benefit because they need help with communications. They need help from folks at the policy school. They need help doing research from folks at the Graduate School of Social Work. They need help for legal research and so on from folks at the law school. So that was sort of the idea, is like providing this multidisciplinary assistance. And in particular, over the last 6 years or so, most of my work has been focused on the issue I talked about at the beginning, this sort of overinvestment in mass criminalization and underinvestment and all the other things that communities need. So we called this justice reinvestment. We called this divest invest. Now it's become known as defund over the last year or so. But really supporting communities who are taking on those types of campaigns with all these other folks from the university.
Okay. So, and how does that, so you said you want to be a conduit for students and faculty on one hand to connect with communities on the other. How precisely does that happen? I mean, could you give us a sense of what's the infrastructure, what's the mechanism of that process?
Sure. Yeah, it's there are a number of different pathways where folks get involved. There's one through the courses that we teach.
Mhm.
So last semester I taught um, uh, a course at the policy school. I taught courses at the law school, taught undergrad courses with folks who are interested in what they call here socio-legal studies or criminal justice issues. Teaching another course at the Graduate School of Social Work. So getting those different pipelines of students involved. But then students also do they do internships with us, externships with us. We partner with professors who have class projects where they have their students working with us at the lab to do something that is beneficial to the community partner that we have.
Could you give a sense though of what those? I mean, it sounds fast. I'm interested because this is real. I think this is the it's a vital and timely project because it really addresses one of the big gaps, which is that you have people kind of inside the university and they're doing their research and doing their thing, and then you have people outside, and the two never meet.
Right.
So they're each working in isolation, and you're trying to overcome that. It sounds like, but could you give us an example of a specific project or two? You talked about students doing internships with you or externships or working on projects that you're working on. What are some of those projects? Who are the outside partners? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one example, not far from where you are. So we work with an organization called the Black Organizing Project in Oakland. And for 10 years, they were leading a campaign to get police out of Oakland public schools. And specifically in Oakland, they had their own school police department. So their campaign was to close the Oakland School Police Department. And last summer, after that 10-year campaign, they won. The school board passed what was called the George Floyd resolution. And so what we've been helping them do since then is they basically had until December 31st to close down that school police department. So we help them with a variety, and students help them with a variety of research to figure out sort of what were the bare minimums that we needed to do to fulfill that legal obligation, and on the policy level to make sure everyone's bases were covered, so that when an incident happened that would formerly have been handled by police, that now everybody knew, and it was codified in policy where who was going to get the call. You know what I mean?
And so was your client the school district, or was it the Black Organizing Project?
Black Organizing Project.
Okay.
And so now that they actually closed the district, now there's this really exciting opportunity where they can reinvest the funds that used to go to the police. And they're going to go through this process of sort of reimagining what a supportive school culture will be. How do we create a more developmentally focused school culture? So we have, folks in the policy school and in the education school and in the law school doing research on various aspects of this. So what are some models that we can lift up from other school districts? What are some programs from other types of institutions that we can lift up? How are we going to work around the various legal requirements that the state of California has put on schools for how they respond to, safety and discipline issues in doing these things? So all those sorts of questions, we're helping them navigate that.
Right. And has that been and how long have you been working with them? Has that been a multi-year project, or is it you do something 1 year and then you do something 3 years later? How does that take shape?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of, so the Social Movement Support Lab's only been around since the fall, so everything's new. Okay. But I've been working with Black Organizing Project in one form or another for many years. So there are some projects that are sort of discrete, time-limited, relatively short to medium term type things. There are other projects like I've worked with an organization here in Denver for about 16 years now,
Wow.
pretty much straight.
Mhm.
There's another organization in Chicago that I've worked with straight for about 11 years. Um,
Wow.
so it's both.
And so I forgot that the Social Movement Support Lab actually was just founded during COVID. So this is, I guess, what you're going to be doing is bringing a lot of your projects that predated the lab into the institutional structure of the university.
That's right.
So that, okay. And this is, and it sounds like, and this is a multidisciplinary project encompassing the law school, policy school, other schools on campus, undergraduates, graduate students, everybody's in. Okay.
Correct.
So let me, in the last several minutes here, let me ask you maybe a delicate question. What have been the challenges of trying to do this type of racial justice work within the confines of a university?
Well, um, one of the reasons why, I mean, I came into a very fortuitous situation for this kind of thing, because at the University of Denver, there was already something called IRISE. And I can't for the life of me think of what the acronym stands for, but
We
it
have the
was,
same problem. Acronyms
yeah.
that nobody knows what they mean. Yep.
Yeah, it was a community of sort of racial justice and critical race minded faculty members who basically organized themselves over the years under the leadership of Dr. Tom Romero. And not only had they come together to support each other's work, but they also came together in support of community-based scholarship. So one of the reasons why I hadn't done this kind of thing before is because, I had no interest in organizing faculty members to care about these issues, to care about, to care about working alongside with and in solidarity with communities. But I didn't have to do that here. They already did it. And the other thing was, there's that we work, we sort of have a unique position where we are affiliated with the university, but we're also a self-standing organization. So that creates a little bit more freedom and autonomy than there otherwise might be.
You mean it's a 501c3?
In that, on that trajectory, hasn't happened yet.
That's wonderful.
But the other thing is, if I'm being honest, like, yes, starting anything during COVID is rough, and maybe unwise, but it's if you're doing racial justice work over the last year within university, it's probably the best time to do it. And I suspect you might know something about that too.
Yes.
And so, but I'm also realistic about the fact that we're not always going to be in the moment we're in now.
Yes.
And so, there could be some, interesting tensions down the road.
Yes, and we'll talk about that offline. No, there are. This is one of the, I mean, I do remind people that, extraordinarily, we've had these shifts in consciousness in society before. And, the sad part is that they often are not very long lived. Slavery ended, right, after a war, but then we had 10 years of Reconstruction, right? Civil rights era, major laws that are passed. But again, within a decade, we're in a period of backlash, right? So, there's a window of opportunity here, but there's an open question as to how long that window will remain open.
Very much so.
Okay. So let me ask you, to bring it back to the university, law schools, students, faculty. It's easy for many of us, and I put myself in this category as a faculty member, but also I speak on behalf of students, to really feel, tied up in knots because the world is on fire in some ways, right? Our nation is on fire. We are confronting what can only be called crises that really go to the core of our democracy. And race is prominent there as a problem. Yet here we are, on campus or on Zoom, but in the books, learning about the law when it's been so clear that the killing of George Floyd is a failure of law. Yet here we are in the law school. How do we think about this question of the disconnection, or whether we're even complicit with, wrongdoing within society? How should students in particular think about that as they embark on legal study?
Yeah. I mean, when I teach law school classes, and, law students are often filled with, this righteous indignation,
Yes.
which I love. But what I tell them is, like, it doesn't matter if you're right. It doesn't really matter. Like, you can go through your whole career railing against injustice in whatever field you're in, knowing in your heart of hearts that you're right, but never being able to make the change that you know is necessary, because it was just just one lawyer against an entire system of oppression. So, so many lawyers want to be Atticus Finch, but his principled stand didn't stop Tom Robinson from being convicted. You know what I mean? And lots of great real life principled stands like it didn't stop mass incarceration from happening. So what I tell them is, it doesn't really matter if you're right. What matters is how many people you can find agreement with, and who can stand together in fighting for what's right. Like, what matters is how much collective power you can build and aggregate to make change. That's how you can take that righteous indignation and channel it into something that that feels meaningful and productive. And I mean, that's the only reason why I still practice law. I would have burned out a long time ago if I hadn't found that. And so the other thing I would say is to folks is, if you're really, or two other things, I guess, if you're really on fire about the stuff that's happening right now, I would explore movement lawyering. I would explore the many writings and that are out there on it. There's, the Movement Law Lab has put out some great curricula on the subject. I was a part of some of those efforts. There's a really wonderful community of folks who have really come together across all disciplines, all forms of practice, to really center racial justice movements. So I would encourage that. And the other thing I would do is, I do this in the book, and I also do this on my website, richthankstoracism.com, is I think the most important thing that any one person can do in promoting racial justice is contribute whatever time, energy, and money you have to support the work of grassroots racial justice organizations, base building organizations that are working on these issues. I mean, these are the folks who've taught me most of the worthwhile things that I know in my career, and who are really leading the charge to dismantle these systems. And I say this to everybody, but it's, maybe especially true for Stanford students, Stanford law students, and other students who, when you leave the institution, or even while you're in the institution, you have like real wonderful skills and abilities that you can contribute. And these organizations need those. So I would encourage folks to find an organization or multiple organizations in their community, or a community that's meaningful to them, and see how you can plug in. That not only is it, I think, good for the world, but I also think it can make your experience as a student far more meaningful if you have, particularly when everything that's going on out in the world is going on. Like, I would hate to see people feel like they're missing out on that completely because there happen to be in a degree program or something. So if, to the extent you can, try and keep, at least a toe in some of that work.
Okay, that is a great point to end on. Let me only add that you all should read and refer, and we will continue to promote Rich from Racism: How the Ultra Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice. It examines both a high-level question of how rich people profit from racism, and also more nitty-gritty policy issues related to criminal justice and mass incarceration, to educational inequity, and to an unjust and sometimes needlessly cruel system of immigration. So congratulations on completing such an important project, and thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That ends Tuesday Race Talks for today. Everyone have a good day, stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you again soon.